Sanctions against Russia continue to multiply, but what will the effect be on the state and on Russian people? Today I'm talking to someone who knows both Russia's leadership and its citizens very well. Hello, Sergei. Delighted to have you on.
Hi, Tim. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Sergei, you've got a book coming out, and that argues that Putin's one of the dictators who refashioned this strongman image from the 20th century to, a more sophisticated, globally connected world. Is that still true?
Tim, thank you very much. It's a great question. Indeed, the book is about this new model of 21st century dictatorship, which, as we show with the data, is the dominating model now among the autocracies. And Putin was one of the key players in that. He was not a pioneer. We talk about leaders who were before him, but he was one of the most successful, as we call them, spin dictators. Dictators who pretend to be democrats, who use manipulation of information, who allow opposition as long as opposition cannot come to power, who allow independent media as long as independent media don't reach out to many people. And so then we finished the draft a year ago. The book is actually coming up in the US in April and in London in June. When we were finishing the book, we said there are signs that Putin is actually moving back in time. So the idea is that the spin dictatorship is well suited to globalized world, to the modern economy, where you use technology, where you attract foreign investment. But at some point, you actually hit a wall. If there are too many people who understand what's going on, who are harder to fool, you need to choose whether you divest your dictatorial institutions and slowly or quickly democratize, and that happens very often, or you move back in time. And this is something we observed in Venezuela, for example, when Chavez was a typical spin dictator, while Maduro is a typical fear dictator, straight out of 20th century. And so a year ago, we said Putin may be moving this direction too. And that is what we see now. Once the war has started, the Russian economy is becoming a war economy. Russian information sphere is becoming war censorship, military censorship. All independent media are banned, and dissent is actually criminalized for up to 15 years in jail. So yes, the short answer to your question is Putin is no longer a spin dictator. He is straight out of mid-20th century from, I would say, Germany. That is the model. That is the model we observe now.
And there was a consensus amongst economists over the last several decades that those economic gains that Russia got from opening up, from changing during the 90s and beyond, well, they wouldn't be the sorts of things that any leader, any dictator even, would be prepared to gamble with in the pursuit of some territorial ambition. Are you surprised that Putin is now willing to make that gamble?
Yes and no. I very much like the words gamble, because in economics and especially in finance, people occasionally talk about gamble for resurrection. When you see that you're going to hit a wall, when you see that you find no other solution for surviving in the office, and that is what was happening to Putin before the war. His approval ratings were coming down because his system could not generate economic growth, and so his popularity was coming down, and so he needed another Crimea. In a sense, Putin remembered 2014, where again, before 2014, Russian economy was losing steam, growth rates were coming down, popularity of Putin was coming down, and so Putin grabbed Crimea and popularity went up. And today he was hoping for this. That was a gamble. So he captures Kyiv in 2 days, he installs a puppet government. Puppet government says whatever he wants to hear, and then he comes back to Russians and say, I'm reunifying Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. By the way, talking about Ukraine, let's not forget that Belarus is de facto captured by Putin. It's just less of a human tragedy and bombing, but by now Russia also controls Belarus. And so that was the gamble. He took this gamble, which had zero chances to succeed, because even if he captured Kyiv, that would be an insurgency similar to Afghanistan in Soviet times. But he tried to capture Kyiv exactly because he was ill-advised. People say he's a madman, but this is observationally equivalent to being misinformed. And that is not a bug, it's a feature of a system that Putin has built. Once you suppress dissent, once your advisors no longer can stand up to you and criticize your decision making, you are surrounded by yes men who say our army is great, There is no corruption. All money was spent on the army, made it stronger. Ukrainians are weak. Ukrainians love you. We spent a lot of money cultivating pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine, and none of this money was diverted to Swiss bank accounts. So once you get this information, you think it's going to be another Crimea all over again, 2 or 3 days, and that's fine.
We're in this strange economic in-between time at the moment where stock markets are closed, the ruble's not convertible, so we don't know what the impact has been. Do you have any idea what the short-term impact of these sanctions will be?
So there are forecasts that the second quarter will be a 20% recession, but I think this forecast is 1 week old, and so forecasts are being updated as more and more companies are exiting Russia, and more talented people are leaving Russia, and more sanctions are imposed on Russia. And some of the sanctions are not actually imposed by the government, but by the people and the companies. So there is no embargo on Russian oil, but a lot of Western companies that buy and transport oil actually say this is blood money, this is toxic commodity, we will not do that. And that reduces the incoming sources of hard currency and fiscal resources. So we don't know indeed what the impact is. The surveys of economists are now that the year 2022 will see a recession of 8 or 10%. That may be a bit of inertia in those forecasts because people move very slowly in their grasping how catastrophic the situation is. But if it is a minus 10% recession, that's the biggest recession in modern Russian history, the biggest one since 1991 when it was a different country. And in terms of quality of life, we are moving back either to 1990 or 1991. In some cases, we moved to 87 before McDonald's came to Russia. And so in that sense, this is a catastrophic scenario, but it is indeed very hard to figure out how exactly it will play out. Inflation is going up. Many businesses will collapse. Many businesses will have to close down because they rely on imports. It's not just the fact that ruble is weak, which makes those businesses competitive, but it's also inability to sell to international markets, inability to produce because you depend on Western components, and inability to finance production because interest rate is now at 20, the policy rate is at 20, and inflation will probably increase and create a lot of disruption in all kinds of ways. So a lot of businesses will suffer and struggle.
Yeah, give me your insights on policy there. Last week I was talking to Steve Cicchetti and Kim Schoenholz about those central bank sanctions, which seem to have put the Russian policymakers on the back foot. They've now had a week or two to try and work out what to do about it. What do you think that they can do?
So these sanctions were a game changer. They were unexpected, and Russia was unprepared for those sanctions. And the reason for that, I think, is Mr. Putin designed this war without talking to his economic policy team. So economic policy team was unaware how far Mr. Putin would go, and therefore how strong the response would be. And basically, Russian central bank reserves are one of the key pillars of Russian macroeconomic stability. So once this pillar is removed, suddenly the hell opens loose. The other pillar is not the stock of central bank reserves, but the flow of petrodollars coming in. So the stock is now gone. Russia cannot access its foreign currency reserves. But in principle, if Russia continues to export oil and gets paid for this, with high oil prices that we observe today, Russia will be fine. And that's why America is now imposing oil embargo, which is also something that nobody expected. Europe is discussing this as we speak, and private sector doesn't want to buy Russian oil. So in that sense, that is the battleground right now. The central bank currency reserve sanctions were a first big shot in this game, but now every mind is focused on potential oil embargo by the whole United West. Currently, Germany is resisting, but there is analysis by German economists, including my colleague Moritz Schularik, that suggests that Germany can survive without major economic shocks, can survive switching off Russian gas and oil. And Americans understand that. Americans work with even Venezuela, Iran, with Saudi Arabia trying to increase supplies of oil. So this is not impossible. Things which we thought are unlikely or even out of the question are now happening. And central bank reserve sanctions, as you mentioned, are one of those things. They are not unprecedented. They were imposed on Afghanistan, Venezuela, Syria, but Russia thought it's in a different league. Now it's actually in a different league in the sense that Iran does have a stock market. Russia is kind of getting close to North Korea.
When we're talking about that oil and gas embargo, I spoke to Luis Garicano last week on the podcast about it, and he very strongly argued that Europe should immediately cut off its consumption of oil and gas. Otherwise, it is basically supporting the Russian state. The Russian state has enough revenue coming in to keep going. Do you support that argument?
Yeah, I fully agree with this argument. I listened to that podcast, and actually yesterday I talked to Luis Garicano in European Parliament. So I think it's completely correct. So indeed, the stock of currency has been frozen, but the flow continues. And when oil prices are as high as we observe today, every day Europe pays about 1 billion euros to Russia. And so these stocks are being replenished day after day. And so the sooner these sanctions are introduced, the shorter the war will be, and the shorter the shock to Europe itself will be. And don't forget that every day of war is costly not just for Ukrainian lives or Ukrainian economy, but also for Europe. Now, the protracted war will have a huge implication on European economy, whatever happens, including through a refugee crisis, which we've not seen since World War II. People refer to Syrian refugee crisis, but this crisis is actually bigger. We are now talking about 2.5 million refugees, and probably there'll be 5. So the situation is dire, and as long as Putin doubles down and keeps bombing civilian residential areas, we'll see more and more refugees.
Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Russian civilians and how they'll cope with it. This is something that you'll know very well, having lived most of your life in Russia. We see Western companies packing up, leaving Russia. And we focused this week on the exits of McDonald's and Starbucks, but the Russian economy is not going to collapse because of a lack of hamburgers. That's not going to bring people onto the streets. Of those companies that are exiting Russia, which ones really are consequential?
Well, for Russian oil and gas, it's Shell and BP who exit and stop buying Russian oil. So that is actually the biggest thing. Another big thing is Boeings and Airbuses, which stop servicing the planes that Russia has bought from them, or leased their planes from leasing companies. So Russians cannot fly to Europe anymore. There is, I think, the only airport which is open in Serbia is Belgrade. But sorry, but even Boeings and Airbuses within Russia cannot fly, or will fly without proper maintenance, which is of course dangerous because Boeings and Airbuses stop servicing their planes. Then there are smaller things, smaller in terms of news, but bigger in terms of impact, which is Taiwanese chips, microchips, semiconductors will not be supplied. So whoever wants to produce something in Russia will suffer because they will need to switch to Chinese semiconductors, which are not as good. So all these things are mounting up. And of course, some people indeed will complain that you cannot buy Finnish yogurt or Finnish vodka. That is something that is probably survivable, but a lot of companies will not be able to produce. Russian producer of cars, AvtoVAZ, the famous Lada producer, is actually suspending production because it relies on a lot of imported cars. All the foreign car makers are exiting. So if this situation continues for years, we will see something like Cuba, where you drive 50-year-old cars. I hope that the regime change will come sooner, and I hope the war will stop much sooner. But there is everywhere you look. Of course, Russia has been part of globalized economy, very much unlike Soviet Union, which was isolated. Russia is not isolated, has not been isolated. Even after 2014 annexation of Crimea and sanctions, Russia has been part of the global economy. Foreign companies had enormous presence, sometimes noticeable like McDonald's, sometimes less so. But this is going to be a catastrophic impact at the quality of life. So Russians literally are going back to 1990.
Yes, because you look at how the regime might change, then obviously that has to come from pressure for internal pressure from ordinary Russian people, I guess. We focused very much on the impact of oligarchs here, but what is the day-to-day impact going to be on Russian people in the near future?
It is very hard to judge because independent media are suppressed. As I mentioned, dissent is criminalized. Conversations like we are having with you today within Russia is impossible or punished by up to 15 years in prison. So yet the quality of life is going down, and the main hit on the ordinary Russian is, of course, prices. So ordinary Russian consumes communal utilities, electricity bills and so on, food and medicines. So medicines, half of them are imported, so their prices will now double. And food will probably also be much more expensive. So if you were just above the poverty line, now you will definitely fall below. And so that is a big, big shock. And so Mr. Putin has to choose whether a spin dictator would use oil dollars, remaining oil dollars, to compensate the Russians for this, give them income support. And Mr. Putin's done a little bit on that, but very little. Or pay more to the policemen to beat up the protesters. And I think we are seeing the latter, as Mr. Putin is moving from spin dictatorship to fear dictatorship. He's actually investing in the repression apparatus, in propaganda, in censorship. And that may create a completely different regime. So Russians will be unhappy, but when they will overcome the repression is not clear. And this is why what Luis Garicano was saying is important. Every dollar you send to Russia is not just helping to sustain the war in Ukraine, it's also helping to sustain repression apparatus, which beats up the protesters. Once Putin is fiscally troubled, once he doesn't have enough petrodollars to pay his police, policemen will stop beating up the protesters. And that's when the regime will eventually collapse.
One trend over the last couple of years from the central bank reserves, for example, is to diversify into Chinese securities as well. What's the role of China in this? Could China come in and help to prop up the Russian economy?
So China is the second game changer. So there are two game changers. One is oil embargo, the other one is China. If China wants to bail out Mr. Putin, it can. It will be painful for Mr. Putin, but China can just prepay Mr. Putin for all future cooperation, and that will save him. China cannot quickly and easily substitute exiting foreign companies, exiting Western companies. But in principle, that could be an imperfect substitute. On the other hand, if Mr. Xi calls Mr. Putin and says, stop this war, Mr. Putin will stop this war right away. Because again, if China announces it joins Western sanctions, then Mr. Putin is completely isolated and will not be able to afford anything. However, China is in between. It cannot lose face because it's been a partner of Russia, and it has it has its share of problems with the West. On the other hand, individual Chinese companies and banks so far have been compliant with Western sanctions. So if the US says we'll impose American sanctions on any company which breaks our oil embargo, Chinese banks, Chinese companies will comply. Also, China publicly supports territorial integrity of Ukraine because China believes that Taiwan is part of China and therefore will not support any politics around recognizing independence of parts of other countries. So in that sense, China is in between. And I think bringing China on board will be a huge game changer if the West wants to stop this war.
There's so many questions unanswered. I'm sure that we'll be talking about this again in the near future. Sergei, for now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's been great.
The book we mentioned is called Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century, and the authors are Sergei GURIEV and Daniel Treisman. It is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. Now, also last week in our audio podcast series, Vox Talks Economics, we spoke to Luis Garicano about the Ukraine war. He talked about the responsibilities of European countries to impose sanctions and what those sanctions are likely to achieve. So check that out as well. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.